All right, it's so good to see everyone this morning, and Happy New Year. It's really good to see visitors here. A lot of people are probably in town with family and things like that, and it's so good to see everyone. And it's so good to see the people who've been here since I've been here. I feel like the past 2 weeks, as I've been away, I feel like I've missed a lot. I missed the Sunday where I think it was like a dozen or more of the men here all had the same shirt on. I missed that. I was sad about that. I saw the video. That was really cool. But I really missed being here. And as we were singing this morning, I was just like, I don't know if you've ever experienced this, but when you're singing hymns and you're like smiling so much, it's like hard to sing. That's how I felt this morning. I was like, it was hard to sing just because I was so happy to be back. I went to California for a little bit and then was home in Houston for a while, and then I was part of the whole Southwest debacle. We practice forgiveness as Christians, so it's all okay. But I ended up getting back much later than expected, and so I missed more services here than I was definitely wanting to, and so it's just so good to be back and see everyone this morning. And it's great to be here in a new year, 2023. So good to see everyone. This morning, I actually wanted to start with a bit of an exercise, I guess. Not the like New Year's resolution kind of exercise that maybe a lot of people have on their list, but it's sort of a mental exercise this morning. And although that might be good, we might be kind of tired. A lot of us probably stayed up late. We're like, stand up, we'll do something real quick, get our blood flowing. But I want us to think about, like, imagine God is thinking about you. Wherever you imagine he is, maybe you imagine him on his throne, maybe you imagine him around his divine counsel, maybe you imagine him, I don't know, everywhere, omnipresent as he is. But I want you to imagine that God is thinking about you. And as you imagine that, what do you assume God feels about you when you come into his mind? And I want you to maybe try to answer that in a way that is as sincere and honest as you can, and maybe not just in a time like this when we're singing hymns and we're around fellow believers, but maybe also in your day-to-day life, throughout your week, in the highs and lows of life. What do you imagine God feels about you, or what is his disposition toward you when you come to his mind? I think that's a really interesting question. Maybe there's a lot of ways to answer it, but as you think about maybe how you would answer it, I want to share also, I'm trying something new in the new year. I've never preached from an iPad before, so we'll see how this goes. No one text me. But in 2006, Baylor University conducted a national survey where they asked a question very similar to that. And the answers they got were really interesting. Only 23% of people believed God to be benevolent or loving toward them. On the other hand, 32% believed God to be authoritarian or angry, sort of the towering, judgmental figure. 16% perceived God as critical. 24% perceived God as distant, and not just distant as in removed, but disinterested, apathetic. And if you're wondering where the other, I think it's like 5% is, the 5% claim to be atheist. And so maybe a different answer came to mind for you as you reflected on that. What does God feel toward you? What's his disposition toward you? But I think what research like this suggests is, and I believe it to be true from experience and in talking and conversing with other people, the great majority, or at least a surprising number of people and a surprising number of Christians believe that God's fundamental disposition toward us is either anger, apathy, or disappointment. And maybe that is an experience that you can relate to. And I can say, at least for my own life and my own experience of faith, I was someone who grew up in the church, as we say, and that, I think, is an accurate description of many times the way that I perceived God's feel and disposition toward me. Maybe not toward everyone, but at least for me, I often thought of God's disposition toward me as perhaps at times angry, apathetic, disinterested, or disappointed. And the question that raises in my mind is somewhat two things which we really only have time to reflect on. One of the questions is, does it really matter? Right? Does it really matter the way, should we concern ourselves about the way that God feels toward us, or should we stop talking about all the feeling stuff? Maybe we talk too much about feelings in the 21st century and we should just worry about doing what God says. And I get where that question comes from, and I wish we had time to talk more about that. But maybe just by answering the second question, we'll see how important it is. And the real question that this gets at is, why do we think this way? On an intellectual level, if we were to give the right Bible answer, the answer that we know to be true, we would answer the first response, it was 23%. We'd be a part of the 23% of people that perceive God as loving, because we know that's the right answer. And yet, there are these moments in perhaps long periods of time where what we actually experience within us is an assumption that God feels angry or apathetic or disappointed in us. And the truth is, we probably think that for a lot of reasons. There's many factors that contribute to it, but perhaps what it all can be boiled down to, or at least one of the main reasons why we think this way, is because we assume that we assume God feels this way about us because we believe that God's feeling toward us is based on our performance. Maybe that's the best way of putting it. The reason we think this way, the reason we assume that God is angry or apathetic or disappointed, is because we assume that God's feeling toward us, that his disposition toward us, is based upon our performance, especially our moral or religious performance. And the reason that we assume that, I think, is because that's how many things in life work. When you're growing up and you're playing sports, or you are interested in music or art, you are in some ways defined, or a large part of who you are and the way that your growing up years are defined is by your successes or failures in whatever that activity is. Or you get into a college based upon how well you perform in school and on a particular set of exams. Or when you get into your career, you reach that point because it's dependent upon how well you perform in college and in your interview process, and so on life goes. It's so many things in life are based upon how well I perform. Am I succeeding or failing? And it's not only the way that so much of life works, but it's often the way that we perceive ourselves, the way that we evaluate ourselves. So here we are at the end, the beginning of a year, having a year just gone by, and it's a time of self-reflection and evaluation, and that can be a really good thing. But the way that we tend to do that is by reflecting on, how did I perform? Right? Did I succeed or fail in keeping my resolutions from last year? Did I succeed or fail in my Bible reading plan? Did I succeed or fail in my relationships, or in my career goals, or in whatever it might have been that I have? And maybe that becomes a pattern of how we perceive ourselves in life in general, not just an annual thing. not just when it comes to resolutions, but when we reflect on ourselves, maybe at the end of each day, as we close our eyes at night and we run the day back through our mind, we evaluate ourselves. How did I perform? So much of life is based upon our performance. And maybe your evaluation is more nuanced than simply success or failure, but it's all about how am I performing, how am I measuring up, and so often that leads us to assume something like this, that we are the sum total of all our successes and failures, that we are defined by how well we perform in life. And the question that leads us to this morning as we come to the table is that how God sees us? Is that how God sees us? Does God's feeling or disposition change based upon our moral or religious performance? I think we could say that for most of the religions in the world, the answer to that question is yes. The gods of antiquity, the answer would be absolutely yes. It is all about how well you perform to gain the favor of the gods. And I think we could also make the case that that's how the modern day gods or idols of our world work today. You have to perform. You have to meet the standards of whatever it is that you have set your attention and worship on in life. And whatever that thing is will ultimately crush you because you cannot meet that standard of performance no matter what God you make in the world. But is it true of God? Well, I think the God of the Bible is different. And I think we see that from the very beginning. Oftentimes, we think about the beginning, we think about the garden in something like this. We think about sin and the fall and Adam and Eve being banished from the garden and cowering and hiding out in fear from this towering, angry God. And maybe that's an exaggeration, but I think a lot of people perceive it to be that way. But that's not actually how it begins. It actually starts with God delighting in his creation, day by day, saying it's good, it's good, it's good, it's good, it's good. And then mankind is created. And you remember what he says, it's very good. And so it begins with God delighting in his creation, rejoicing in it, exulting in it, and in love. And so after he creates them and God says it's very good, the first act that God makes toward humanity is Genesis 1, I believe it's verse 27, and God blessed them. That's the first act that God makes. That's his first movement toward humans. He exults and he delights and he's in some ways amazed at his creation, at humanity. And his first step toward them is he blessed them. And so God's position from the very beginning is delight and blessing. And while it's true that Adam and Eve forfeited that blessing in the garden, do you remember the very first thing that God says to them after they sin? Where are you? Where are you? And so it's like even in the midst of this sin, God is seeking them out. He's searching for them. And of course, God knows where they are, but he's moving toward them. From the very beginning, from the very first time that sin is introduced into the world. And God in some way clothes their shame by clothing them with the skins of an animal. And even though sin tore apart the structure of our world, God gave them a promise in Genesis 3:15 that he would not leave them in that fallen world, but would crush the powers of evil and redeem the world through the seed of woman. And so the rest of the Bible story is about how God will prove his love for the world by redeeming it no matter the cost. And so we get stories about a God who makes a promise to save the world through the broken and messed up and sinful family of Abraham. We get stories about a God who redeems a multitude of slaves and refugees from the powers of Egypt and proposes a sort of marriage covenant on top of a mountain. We get stories about a God who, in the story of Hosea, chases after a sinful humanity like a wounded but loving husband, faithfully and jealously and relentlessly pursuing his adulterous bride. And we get these beautiful parables describing God as a loving father who runs and embraces and kisses his prodigal son, or a good shepherd who goes out to rescue the one lost sheep, and when he finds him, carries him on his shoulders, rejoicing. And it's like the deeper you go into these stories, the more real and deep and meaningful and profound you find God's love to be. And the more that message becomes clear that when God thinks of you, he doesn't feel disgust or anger or apathy or disappointment. His fundamental disposition toward us is love. And perhaps Romans 5 and verse 6 says it best. There, Paul says that while we were still weak, while we were still helpless, while we could do nothing to put this shalom-shattered world back together, at the right time, Christ died for the ungodly. For one will scarcely die for a righteous person, though perhaps for a good person, one would dare even to die. But God shows his love for us in this, that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. So does God's feeling or disposition change based on our performance? Well, if what we mean by that is, does God ever feel sad or frustrated or perhaps disappointed in our self-harming decisions that we make? Yes. Yes, it breaks his heart just like it would break the heart of any loving father. But if by that do we mean that does God's disposition, his fundamental nature toward us, does that ever change? Does his love toward us ever change? Paul would say the answer is absolutely not. Or maybe we should say absolutely yes, but in the exact opposite way that we would expect. He moves toward us. He races toward us. He's dispositioned from heaven to come down and to seek us. God proves his unfailing, undying, unrelentless, and unconditional love for us in that while we were still sinners and broken, Christ died for us. And so as we gather around the table this morning, I want to close with this. John 17, maybe you're wondering, okay, I can see God's love for humanity, right? John 3:16, God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son. And maybe that's not so hard for us to comprehend, but maybe what's difficult is to have that resonate with us on an individual level. How can I really believe that? I can see how God loves other people, but how could he love me? I still feel like God is angry or disappointed or apathetic or disinterested in me. And I think John 17 helps us with that. Here is Jesus in his high priestly prayer, and he prays a lot for the disciples, but at the end of this prayer, look what he says in verse 20. He says, my prayer is not for them alone. It's not just for the disciples who are gathered in this upper room, but I pray also for those who will believe in me through their message, that all of them may be one, Father, just as you are in me and I am in you. May they also be in us, so that the world may believe that you have sent me. I've given them the glory that you gave me, that they may be one, even as we are one. I in them and you in me, so that they may be brought to complete unity. And then this, that all the world may know that you have sent me and loved them even as you have loved me. Think about that for a moment. God says, or Jesus in this prayer, he reflects on the love of God, saying it's not just for the select people of Israel. It's not just for the people who are gathered in this upper room, or even for all the people who come to believe in their message. He opens it up in a way that is so powerful and almost unbelievable. He says that this love is for all the world, including people who never even come to follow him, including people who choose to persist in sin, including people who reject him and want nothing to do with him and blaspheme his name. God, his disposition toward even the most vilest of sinners is undying, unquenchable love. And the way that love works, the way that he loves every single person, is with the same love with which he loves his only begotten Son. And that is a love that's so amazing, so divine. It demands my soul, my life, my all. You're not defined by your performance. You're not defined by the sum total of your successes or failures. You're defined by the love of God, by the love that God has for you in Christ, unconditioned by your success or failure. And imagine a world that actually believed that. God shows his love for us in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. We'll now ask the men to come forward as we gather around the table.